Welcome to the Butterfly Book Club. Here you will not find any AI generated content. I am a real person reading from a real paper book, and you will occasionally hear me turning the pages, maybe clearing my throat, and definitely correcting any mispronunciations that I catch myself making. Today we are reading The Best of Clarence Day Life with Father by Clarence Day Jr. And this chapter is called A Holiday with Father. So go ahead and grab a nice hot cup of tea, curl up on your favorite chair, and pull up a cozy blanket over you and enjoy the story. Once in a long while, as a great treat, Father took me down to his office. This could happen only on a Saturday morning when there was no school. I felt very important and grown up on the days I went to the office, not after I got there to be sure, but as I was leaving the house, with Mother and my 3 little brothers respectfully seeing me off. If it was a rainy day, Father would prepare for rough weather by wearing a derby hat and a black rubber mackintosh over his usual tailed coat. He seldom was informal enough to wear a sack suit in town, except on warm days, or when he left New York to go to the country in summer. If the sun was out, he wore a silk hat and carried a cane, like his friends. When he and they passed each other on the street, they raised their canes and touched the brims of their hats with them, in formal salute. I admired this rich and splendid gesture and wished I could imitate it, but I was too young for a cane. I was soberly dressed in a pepper and salt sack suit, with short pants and the usual broad, flat white Eton collar that boys wore in the 80s. A collar that started out very stiff and immaculate every morning, and was done for by dinner time. Black laced or buttoned shoes and black stockings. We only wore brown in the country in summer. On one of these Saturdays, although it was sunny, Father put on his derby. I didn't know why until later. I hopped along by his side as he walked through the long rows of comfortable-looking brownstone houses from Madison Avenue over to 6th, climbed the stairs of the elevated, and stood on the platform, chatting with one of his friends while we waited for the next train. Soon, a stubby little steam engine with its open coal car, piled full of anthracite, and its 3 or 4 passenger cars swinging along behind, appeared around the curve. White smoke poured from the smokestack. The engineer leaned out from his window. Toot, 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 whistled the engine as it came puffing in. We got on board and walked leisurely through the cars till Father found a seat that he liked. During the journey downtown, except when the smoke from the engine was too thick for me to see out, I stared fascinatedly into the windows of cheap red brick tenements, or at the even more interesting interiors of lodging houses for tramps. The second-floor rooms of the lodging houses were crowded, but I envied the tramps in them. They looked so easy-going. Not a thing to do. Just tilt their chairs back against the wall in comfortable old clothes and smoke. If I were a tramp, I wouldn't have to scrub every last bit of grime out of my knuckles each Friday and put on tight white kid gloves and pull some unwieldy little girl around a waxed floor at dancing school. It wouldn't cost so very much either. The lodging house sign said in big letters, 10 cents a night. I never had a chance to see such sights except when I went downtown with Father, for Mother kept away from the elevated. It was comparatively new, and she felt that the horse cars were better. Besides, 6th Avenue was so cindery and sooty that ladies disliked it. They did go that far west sometimes to shop, and they went as far as East Lexington, and they went as far east as Lexington. But in general, they lived and walked in the long narrow strip between those two boundaries. When Father and I left the train at the end of our journey, I found myself in a tangle of little streets full of men and boys, but no women. If some lonely bonnet chanced to be bobbing along in the crowd, we all stared at it. Most of the business buildings were old, and many of them were dirty, with steep, well-worn wooden stairways and dark, busy basements. Exchange Place and Broad Street were full of these warrens, and there were some even on Wall Street. The southern corner of Wall Street and Broadway was one of the dingiest. Father raised his cane and said as we passed, "That's where Great-Aunt Lavinia was born." A few doors beyond the Essay office, we came to a neat but narrow 5-story building and walked up the front stoop. This was number 38 Wall Street. Father's office occupied the ground floor at the top of the stoop, and on the back part of the second floor he had a small storeroom. The office was busy in what seemed to me a mysterious way. The cashier, who never would let me go inside his cage, sat in there on a stool with a cash drawer, a safe full of books, another safe for securities, and a tin box full of postage stamps, which he doled out as needed. 1 or 2 bookkeepers were making beautifully written entries in enormous leather-bound ledgers. They had taken the stiff white detachable cuffs off their shirt sleeves and stacked them in a corner, and they had exchanged their regular jackets for black alpaca coats. Future bookkeepers or brokers who were now little office boys ran in and out. Western Union messengers rushed in with telegrams. In the front room, there was a long table full of the printed reports issued by railroads about their earnings and traffic. Only 20 or 30 industrial stocks were traded in on the exchange in those days, and Father's office ignored them. On or around the table were the Commercial and Financial Chronicle, the Journal of Commerce, a blackboard, a ticker, and 4 or 5 whiskery men. 2 were arguing heatedly about Henry Ward Beecher, and the others were shaking their heads over some crazy proposal by the Knights of Labor to have an 8-hour day. Father went into his private office, where a little coal fire was burning, hung his hat on a rack, and unlocked and sat down at his desk. While he opened his mail, I proudly brought in 2 stone jugs of ink, one of greenish-black made in England, and one to use when he wrote letters of which he wished to keep copies, because with this ink impressions could be taken to put in his files. I cleaned and filled all Father's inkwells and put fresh steel pens in his pen holders. He had quill pens at home, but he used only steel pens at the office, and as he had no stenographer, he wrote a good share of the firm's letters in longhand himself. There were lots of things to do in the office besides filling inkwells. It was fun to scamper around the streets carrying all the messages, which are telephoned nowadays, or to roll colored pencils down the clerks' slanting desks, or try to ring the bell on the typewriter. The latter was a new contraption which seldom was used on important occasions. The latter was a new contraption which seldom was used except on important occasions, when the bookkeeper or one of the office boys had to stop work and pick at it. All of a sudden it was noon. The customers left. The ticker came to a stop. At 12:30, Father called to me, and we went out for lunch. "Will you be back, Mr. Day?" the cashier asked respectfully, but eagerly too. On the days when Father said yes, All the clerks looked disappointed. They bent over their desks, saying nothing, till Father went out the door. But if I lingered behind for a moment, I heard them slamming their ledgers about. Not only did they and the office boys all have to stay, but the rule was that they couldn't even smoke until Father had gone home for the day. Today he said no, however. I saw them getting out their sulphur matches as he was crossing the threshold, and the instant he stepped into the hall, they struck them on the seats of their pants. I trotted along at Father's side down to Beaver Street, where there stood a mellow old building. It had the look of a friendly, hospitable country hotel. There were green blinds and little outside balconies on its upper floors, and windows with looped lacy curtains, and white pillars stood at the entrance, at the top of a low flight of steps. This was Delmonico's, and the food was so good there that even I had heard it talked of uptown. It was one of the places that had just suited people like Father. Delmonico's stood upon a triangular-shaped plot of ground, while the front doors at the apex, with the front doors at the apex, and when we arrived we met a bottle-necked jam at the entrance. Silk-hatted men who had been lunching in a lingering way had suddenly remembered, apparently, that they were due back in Wall Street, and they were shoving each other, politely but urgently, to force their way out. As Father and I went in the long, crowded room, the head waiter led us with a flourish to a table for two. The air was fragrant with cigar smoke and the appetizing smell of rich, greasy cooking. A stately-looking foreigner who was standing at the side of the room caught Father's eye and bowed to him in a dignified way. "Lorenzo," Father said to him as he approached us, "this is my son." I bobbed my head at him, rather embarrassed, and Mr. Lorenzo Delmonico bowed and said he was happy to meet me. As he left us, old Francois, Father's regular waiter, hurried up to our table, and he and Father had a talk, in French, about the best dish to order. They spoke so rapidly that I couldn't understand a word of it, except that Francois kept assuring Father that we could rely on the sauce. Parfaitement. It seemed that the last time that Father had relied on this sauce, an admittedly difficult kind, he had had a severe disappointment. When anything of this sort occurred, I had noted, Francois had a healing way of dealing with such a catastrophe. He seemed even more shocked and perturbed at a failure than Father, and he would snatch the offending dish away and come racing back with a substitute. Usually he was accompanied at such moments by one of the Delmonico family, Lorenzo or Charles, who bent over the table to examine the new dish as it was placed before Father, murmuring most sympathetically about the unhappy misfortune. Today, the sauce and everything else was not only successful, but perfect, and Father and Francois smiled and nodded in a congratulatory way to each other. I used to wonder why Father never got into rages at Delmonico's as he did at home, but I see now that he may have felt lonely at home, where there were no brother experts. Father was fond of French cooking and of being served by French waiters. At home he had to put up with an Irish waitress, who was changed every few months, and with cooking which, though excellent of its kind, after all, wasn't French. He ate it with relish and gusto when it came up to his standards, but he did so like a city man in the country, enjoying good, simple fare. I didn't always appreciate French cooking myself. It tasted all right, but it was dainty, and there wasn't much of it. It seemed to me that Father got along with a very light lunch. When he was having his demi-tasse, however, and saw a hungry look on my face, he smiled understandingly and beckoned to Francois, who smiled too, and presently came running back with a large chocolate eclair. The richness of its soft, thick yellow interior and the meltingness of its chocolate outside were so delicious that time stood still as I happily ate it, and I almost forgot where I was. After lunch, instead of taking me back uptown, Father walked down to the Battery, and to my surprise, we got on the boat at South Ferry. We had never done this before. I now saw why he was wearing his derby. We were going out to the country. Off we steamed across the sweet-smelling bay filled with sailboats and four-masted schooners and tugboats and barges. And when we landed on Staten Island, Father told me that we were going to see Buffalo Bill. We got seats in a flimsy wooden stand full of splintery benches, and there was the Wild West, spread out before us, dust, horses, and all. The wonderful marksmanship of riders who hit glass balls with their rifles, balls tossed into the air and shot at with careless ease as the horsemen dashed by. The herds of cattle, the lariats, the brass band, the old Deadwood stage-coach, the thrilling attack on it by Indians, the last-minute rescue. Father dragged me out just before the rescue so that we could get seats on the ferry boat, but I caught a glimpse of it anyway as I was being hauled through the exit. I wanted to be a cowboy. I told Father on the way home. He chuckled and said no, I didn't. He said I might as well be a tramp. I wondered if I'd better tell him that this idea too had occurred to me no further back than that very morning. I decided that upon the whole it mightn't be a good day to mention it, just after Father had taken me to lunch at Delmonico's. I did venture to ask him, however, what was the matter with cowboys. Father briefly explained that their lives, their food, and their sleeping accommodations were outlandish and slummy. They lived in the wilds, he informed me, and they had practically gone wild themselves. Put your cap on straight, he added. I am trying to bring you up to be a civilized man. I adjusted my cap and walked on, thinking over this future. The more I thought about it, the less I wanted to be a civilized man. After all, I had had a very light lunch, and I was tired and hungry. What with fingernails and improving books and dancing school and sermons on Sundays, the few chocolate eclairs that a civilized man got to eat were not worth it.